Okay, so thank you everyone for joining this peer review workshop hosted by the Mineralogical Society. Just before we get started, I would like to run through a few basic housekeeping items. First of all, we'd like to ask if you can keep yourself muted at all times throughout the session, just because there are quite a few of us here today, and this will allow the workshop to run as smoothly as possible. The session will run for about an hour and a half. If you do have any questions during that time, please feel free to write them in the chat at any time throughout the presentation. There will be about 30 minutes after the main presentation where we'll go through the questions and answer as many as we can. We might not get to all of the questions, but we will send answers to all of the questions around to everyone after the workshop. And just to let you know, today's meeting will operate under the Mineralogical Society's Code of Conduct, and it will be recorded for later hosting on the Society's YouTube channel. So we'll hear from a few people today. First, we'll hear from Kevin Murphy, who's worked for the Mineralogical Society for 32 years, and his role has always included working on the journals from receipt of manuscripts through to production and post-publication, and also marketing. We'll also hear from Eric Dukowski, who works as a reviewer for Clay Minerals, and from Dave Good, who works as a reviewer for Mineralogical magazine. And also with us today, we have Roger Mitchell, who's one of the principal editors of Mineralogical magazine. And we also have the principal editors of Clay Minerals, who are George Christidis and Chunhui Zhao. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kevin.
Thanks very much, Chris, and welcome to everybody. It's lovely to have so many people here. We have people from 20 countries registered for today's event, and I'm glad to welcome you all. MinMag and Clay Minerals are international journals. As Chris says, I've worked for the Society for 32 years. My first role was as an editorial assistant working on Mineralogical magazine, and I've spent the last 32 years learning how to become a better editor. This course is run on behalf of the Mineralogical Society of the UK and Ireland, and its contents are relevant to any journal. I think today's training can be used or deployed for any journal that you're asked to work for. Mineralogical magazine, or MinMag as we call it, has been published continuously since 1876. Clay Minerals is 75 years old this year. So both journals of long standing and good reputations. Our journals are published in conjunction with Cambridge University Press. This presentation includes some slides adapted from slides provided by Cambridge, and I thank Chris and Catherine Hill for providing those for me. We will have input from Eric Dukowski and Dave Good, both reviewers of high standing for our journals and for other journals as well. I can talk you through the mechanics of reviews and so on, and how we as a publisher use them and how we would like you to interact with us. But I'm hoping that Eric and Dave will give us the secrets of, what to do when you get that invitation, you've accepted it, and that's where we want to go with them. So I also wanted to acknowledge a reference that I've made to this paper. This is a paper by Fred Mumpton, who's a former editor-in-chief of Clays and Clay Minerals. As you'll see from the title, it really refers to a paper for authors. But like many things in today's conversation, I think the advice we give is as much for authors as it is for reviewers. I would recommend that everybody read this. I think it's a real nice model for how to write good papers, and certainly it'll help in terms of reviewing them also. So why do we do peer review? I'm going to read this first sentence verbatim. It's a result of a survey conducted by Publons, a global survey, 11,000 researchers, which said that almost all respondents consider peer review to be important or extremely important for ensuring the general quality and integrity of scholarly communication. And I think that says it all. We've been publishing journals since the 16th century, and we haven't found a better way to do it than peer review. Peer review allows a paper submitted to our journal to be evaluated and commented upon by independent experts, that's you, who work within the same academic field as the author. It allows to give detailed and constructive feedback on the work. It tries to ensure that the article is sound and accurate, and it provides an opportunity to alert the authors to any gaps in coverage of the literature, which is important. I would add at this point that most journals seek 3 reviews for each paper submitted. So if you submit 1 paper, you should be prepared to review 3. That's how the sums work out. There are 3 main kinds of peer review and several variants of those in existence. And you can see the graph here, which outlines it. So we have a single blind review, which is where the reviewers are aware of the author's identities, but the authors are not informed about the reviewers' identities. This is very common, the most common, in fact, and it's the method we use for both Mineralogical magazine and Clay Minerals at present. Double-blind peer review is where neither the author nor the reviewer is aware of each other's identities. This is also very common, but not quite as common as single-blind. And open peer review is where authors and reviewers are aware of each other's identity. In some journals with open peer review, the reports of the reviewers are published alongside the published paper. This is not common, it's less than 10%. There's also triple blind, where the identity of the editor is also hidden, but that's quite unusual. So why do we do blinding? Why do we hide the identities of anybody? So we hide the identities of the reviewers, or at least we offer to, because some reviewers are happy to make their identities known. But we want reviewers to feel free to speak frankly about the scientific content, and they may not want to do that if they feel that their identity will be made known to the author. There may be reprisal and so on. For double blind, the reviewer isn't aware of who the author is or where they work. We're not evaluating the work based on reputation, we're evaluating the work based on the work. Would the society consider a change to any other method? I think we would. We do reconsider it occasionally. We've never actually changed it yet. No single system is perfect, but we do keep it under review and under watch. And I think for those reviewers who are prepared to allow their identity to be known, it means that they're very conscious of everything that they say to the reviewers, because the reviewers can come back to them and talk to them about it. How does peer review benefit the reviewer, you might ask? Somebody writes you an email out of the blue and says, hey, I'd like you to spend a day or 2 days or whatever reviewing this piece of work, and you don't get paid for it. So how does it benefit you? Well, I think for a successful scientific career requires the scientist to take part in as many facets of the scientific community as possible. That's not just research and writing papers, but it's also communication, it's going to conferences, it's outreach, it's the publication process, of course. And so I've highlighted that part about peer review because the publication process depends absolutely on peer review. I think it's also true to say that reviewing helps you to build on and improve your own work. You can learn from the work of others in your field as you review their work, but it also helps to develop your writing and editing skills. And I think that's really important. And all of this is part of what we refer to as networking. So this is a standard graph that you might have seen elsewhere before of what the peer review system looks like. Papers enter in here at the top left where it says article is submitted, and hopefully down here at the bottom end, it comes out on the right after it's been accepted. I should point out to you that you may not be aware, but 30 to 40% of papers submitted to Mineralogical magazine are ultimately rejected, and that figure is even higher for Clay Minerals at present. So just less than half of all papers are rejected. I think that's quite a high figure, but it's really important that we apply those rigorous standards so that we can make sure that the quality of the material we do publish is as high as we can make it. I should also add that many of the papers that are rejected can go on to be published elsewhere, perhaps. So the benefit of the work that you've done on them is still available to the authors, even if they decide to go and submit elsewhere. So when you first, as an author, submit your paper, journal staff will usually take a look at it in the first instance. Does it contain all of the requisite parts? Has it been prepared in line with the instructions to authors for that journal? Are the figures of good quality? Depending on the answers to those questions, the author may be asked to have another go at preparing the manuscript and resubmitting it. So on its return, it would then be looked at by the journal's editor-in-chief, and they will decide at that point whether the article should proceed to peer review. Is the content relevant? Or maybe is the material of such low quality that it doesn't warrant review? Those are the questions that he or she will ask at that point. And if it's unsuccessful at that stage, the paper will be rejected. And that's what we call a desk rejection before peer review. And that happens in a reasonable proportion of papers, maybe as much as 10% sometimes. If, however, the editor deems that the article is appropriate for peer review, that's the point at which people like yourselves would be involved. Even in spite of this early scrutiny, we do ask that reviewers would also consider the question of whether material is appropriate for our journal. The editors and the staff can't be aware of every single nuanced piece of work, and only the reviewers are intimately aware of whether things are appropriate or not. I picked out this tiny piece of the previous slide because I just wanted to focus on a question that we're often asked by authors. Language editing is something that really refers to authors, but it comes in the question of peer review also. How good does the language need to be in order to be submitted for peer review? And what we say to authors is that the writing must be good enough to be understood readily by reviewers, by the editors and the staff as well, of course. But if it's not clear enough and good enough to be read by reviewers, it's not good enough for review, essentially. And Eric and Dave will touch on this in their slides later on. Publishers do offer support to authors in terms of improving the quality of their language. That often happens post-acceptance, I would have to say. We will do extensive work, and I know my colleague Helen Kirby is here today, and she spends many hours working on the quality of the language submitted by authors for whom English isn't their first language usually. There are agencies out there who can help with the quality of English language. We do ask reviewers if they're able to offer advice on bits and pieces of the language by annotating manuscripts, and I'll touch on that later on. But we do not ask, nor do we expect reviewers to rewrite papers for authors. That's the author's job. So how do you become a reviewer? I think for early career scientists, this is an important question. We want to join the community, we want to play a full role, but how do we begin? Well, for 40% of people, that happens when you've published a piece of work of your own that's relevant. The editor will search for somebody who's worked on something that's relevant to the paper being reviewed. They'll find your name and they'll think, okay, this might be somebody that we could ask. You may be invited to assist with the review by your supervisor or by a colleague, or you might be approached by an editor who's known to you, who met you at a conference or saw your presentation or a poster. The other thing, and one of the things we want to focus on here today, is that you offer to become a reviewer for journals. We at the Mineralogical Society certainly welcome offers of reviewers who write to the editor, say hello, introduce yourself, say what you work on, and tell them that you're willing to be a reviewer. In the bottom part of this slide here, I just show you some of the mechanics of what we'd like you to do. This is the manuscript submission system for clay minerals. And you can see highlighted by the orange arrow, we've got a register now button. This is where we ask reviewers to, as well as authors, to upload their details. When we get to a later part of the registration system, you get one of these screens, and this is where we ask reviewers to highlight all of the subject areas that they're capable of covering. And this gives us, our editorial team, a very clear picture of the material you're able to help out with. And very often, identifying new reviewers depends on being able to identify which specific subject areas you're able to cover. So what other information do we ask you to share with the associate editor, either in advance of becoming a reviewer or after you've been invited to do a review? One of the key things is if you receive a paper and you think, well, part A of this is relevant to me, I understand it, I've worked on it, I know something about it, I can help with that, but I don't know anything about part B. Well, please be sure to tell the editor that. They still value your input on part A, but they'll also then be aware that you haven't looked at or worked on part B. Would encourage you to seek feedback from the editor or associate editor once you've received your review. It's not commonly done, but how else does anybody expect you to learn to become a better reviewer unless by joining a course like today's or by asking for support? And we at the MinSoc, Mineralogical Society, are very happy to offer some mentorship and support and feedback when you've submitted your first reviews. I think this is particularly important for early career researchers or people who are submitting their first few reviews. So what do we ask of you when you become a reviewer? A few things, please. If Roger Mitchell or Chun Hui or George sends you a request to be a reviewer, please respond promptly. Either if you're saying yes or no, please respond promptly. That way, if you say yes, that's fantastic, thank you, we'll go ahead and send you the paper. If you say no, I'm not able to, thank you also, we move on and find somebody else. Please don't ignore those requests, particularly from our journals. If you agree to do a review, please submit your review on time. I know that what's most important is a detailed quality review, and that's primary for us, but we do try and make sure that the time from submission of a paper to acceptance is as short as possible, and from acceptance to publication, we work at making that as short as possible also. Everybody wants their work published quickly. I've highlighted in orange here something that happens quite a bit, and is please don't accept the invitation to review a paper and then not review it. That causes more delay than anything else. We would like you to be familiar with our instructions for authors as you review a paper. Instructions for authors are similar in many journals, but they all have little differences, and so we do like you to be aware of them. We like you to show integrity. If you are asked to review a paper, please keep the contents of the manuscript confidential and let the editor know if there's a conflict of interest. Are you working on something similar yourself, or have you submitted something similar yourself to another journal? And as we'll say throughout the rest of this process and this presentation, and I know that Eric and Dave will touch on it as well, please be constructive. Try to find positive things to say and offer ways where the authors can improve their paper rather than simply criticizing what they've said. To get into the mechanics of the thing, things to check for when reviewing a paper. I think everybody would agree that good organization is key to writing good papers. And this list of subheadings, of level 1 subheadings, comes from the Fred Mumpton paper. Now, journals may or may not use exactly the same headings, but the structure should be very similar. There are very few excuses or reasons for not following a good organization, an organization that looks very like this or something like this. Papers where there are lots more level 1 headings, or they're in a different order, typically are not well organized, and you'll find that it's coming through in your review, that you're finding you're jumping from one part of the paper to another in order to get a full picture of what's going on or what the author is trying to get at. Clearly, there will be subheadings and so on to divide the content into more manageable pieces, but this is a general structure that I think is a good rule of thumb. To delve into those a little bit more detail, the title shouldn't be too long, otherwise people won't read it. It shouldn't be too short, because if it is, it'll be vague and too general. So these two references here mention perhaps up to 16 words as the maximum length of title. What's most important is that you as the reviewer should feel free to contribute to editing the title. Don't assume that that's set in stone. Similarly with the abstract is probably the most important piece of writing and editing that we have in any paper, because it's that which determines whether the reader will carry on reading the work or not. The abstract should explain the work done, the main issues or results addressed, the methods used, and what the conclusions are. Many journals will have a size limit on abstracts. 300 words is not unusual. I think our editors are reasonably flexible about the length of the abstract, but they would expect it to be concise. That means as short as it can be whilst covering all of the things that I just said. We still use keywords in our journals. Not every journal does. The reason we have keywords is because they're used by some search engines. When a reader looks for content to read, they may use a search engine, and if they do, the search engine may depend on keywords to find that content for them to read. So keywords are really important. Don't just allow the author to repeat words that are already given in the title, because they'll be indexed separately. Again, the introduction must convince the reader that it's still worth reading more. Every stage that we come to is a stage where the reader might decide, oh, I've had enough of this, I don't need any more of it. You've got to continually, as an author, and by extension as a reviewer, convince the reader that it's worth carrying on reading. The introduction should set out the nature and scope of the problem being addressed, why that problem is important and needs to be solved, the objectives of the study, and it should give a careful literature review. Each study cited should be an important reference point for this study. And it's your job as a reviewer who's aware of this literature to tell us whether that citation is used inaccurately or appropriately, and say why. For the experimental section, also sometimes known as materials and methods, we should state what materials are studied, how the materials were treated, what analytical methods the authors used, and how the data that resulted were manipulated. And we need all of that information set out very clearly. It's almost a formula that all authors should follow and all reviews should follow. It should be extensive enough that anybody could come along, access the same materials and equipment, and carry out the same experiments and hopefully get the same results. Results and analysis, discussion, conclusions. So the results should be a standalone section. Some people just go straight to the results section and they want to find the results right there. They shouldn't be spread out into the discussion. They shouldn't be given in the analytical section, the materials and methods section. They should be set out in a way that the reader can understand them readily. There should be a thorough analysis of the data presented. It's not the reader's job to interpret the graphs and the data and the charts. And as a reviewer, you're asked to make sure that any sweeping statements issued by the author are backed up by the data that they've presented, and make sure to quiz them on that. The discussion should include the author's evaluation of their data. They should show how they agree or contrast with previous published data and interpret them for the reader. And as I say, the interpretations must be supported by the data presented. For conclusions, the authors should discuss the importance of their findings. It shouldn't be a repetition of the discussion, but it should tell the reader why the new points are significant. It's also an important point to check whether the conclusions match with the objectives set in the introduction. And if they don't match, the paper should explain why. And one of your jobs as a reviewer is to make sure that the author addresses that point. For figures, this is an important point because many reviewers don't check figures, at least don't check them thoroughly in my experience. You should read all of the figures for sense. Are any abbreviations explained? Are the spelling and grammar correct? Do the data tie in with the information presented in the tables or elsewhere in the text? And are the figures clear and sharp? Are they of a high quality of production? I would add that the quality of figures is one of the things that slows down peer review. It slows down production, perhaps as much as anything else in the process. Reference lists, again, not particularly an important job for reviewers, other than to make sure that you check, do the authors comply with the style that the journal expects? It's not a scientific point, but it certainly is one of those ones that takes up time in production subsequently. If we can have that point addressed during review by the authors, it will definitely help to get towards acceptance more quickly. And also, the reviewers should check that the citations cited in the text appear in the reference list and that the reference list only contains references that have been cited. So we move on to ethical aspects. So both Cambridge University Press and we at the Mineralogical Society are committed to meeting high standards of ethical behaviour at all stages. And we set out general expectations of what we want from all of the people involved in the publication process. That's editors, authors, and reviewers. So understanding what all of these mean is important. So for duplication, are you as a reviewer aware that some or all of the work being reviewed has been published previously or perhaps submitted to another journal? If you are, please tell the editor and provide evidence if you can. For plagiarism, ensure that all of the work in the submitted manuscript is original. If it isn't, check that content reproduced from other sources has been acknowledged appropriately and that permission for any material that is being reproduced directly has been sought. If you spot any major errors of fact, clearly we need to know about those. We have legal obligations, and the example given here is in terms of animal subjects. You might wonder how that appears in mineralogy, but it certainly comes up in clay mineralogy, especially health aspects of clays. There are clearly other legal implications, and I already mentioned copyright being one. So most of us will be familiar with the possible outcomes of peer review, accept without any changes, minor revisions, major revisions, and rejection. My colleague Roger Mitchell might add moderate revision in between minor and major. I bring this up here, even though we're most of us aware of it, because I think as people who may or may not have reviewed papers in the past, it's important that you know how common these verdicts are. So major revision of first submissions is the most common verdict we get. Accept without change is very rare. Minor revisions for a first submission are also relatively rare. And they do happen, but it's relatively rare. And they might consist of editing the language a bit, a small number of new citations or mentioning additional topics, additional experiments perhaps, and tweak to the interpretation of the results. That would be considered minor revision. Major revision are structural issues that call for a significant reorganization of the text. More experiments and arguments need to take account of new thoughts or ideas. And the existing analysis of data or evidence is flawed and needs to be reworked. So for minor revision, typically the paper will go on to be accepted. For major revision, that's not necessarily the case. And when our editors reject papers, they sometimes will reject and say, I'd be prepared to consider a thoroughly revised version of this paper as a brand new submission. And sometimes they will say, I reject this paper and I don't think we want to see it again. I wanted to point out why we do that and how common those reactions are, so that when you become a reviewer, you will know what's allowed and accepted and understood to be common. As I say, most papers go back to be revised once, twice, three times even for some papers. And it's very typical that the reviewers who were invited to review the first version will be asked to examine the revised version. And the comments of the reviewers or the referees give authors the opportunity to refine and improve a manuscript. But they're also an opportunity to discuss the comments with which they don't agree. And that's an important point. Not everything you as a reviewer say will be accepted by the author. And not everything will be correct that they say or that you say. So as a reviewer, we ask you to consider those rebuttals, as we refer to them, carefully and with an open mind. Respond objectively and professionally and support your argument with evidence. Don't let it become personal. And most importantly of all, it's the job of the associate editor and the editor to decide if the author's work is appropriate for publication. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong or that the author is right. It's the editor's job to decide on the best way forward. And I think that's a really important point to remember. It doesn't mean that we don't want your views because we don't take them into account or insist that the author does. So that's where we've got up to for now. At this point, I wanted to invite Eric and Dave to come on board and give us the secrets of what they do. So Chris, I'll ask you to switch over to, I think Eric is up first.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my presentation will be basically the extension of what Kevin just presented. So I'm not going to repeat everything that he already said. It will be on the top of his his comments and suggestions. I will present what I do. So here is a few slides how what I do and how I approach when upon receiving the invitation to review. So before I accept, first question that I always ask myself is where the request is coming from. Is the journal legitimate? Because these days we see many open access predatory journals that want to publish papers. That's another, what predatory journal is. It's another topic for probably a different presentation. But that's a journal that basically does a sloppy work and takes money from the authors, and appears legitimate. It's really not. We don't want, as a scientific community, we don't want to support such journals, and we don't want to see them develop at the expense of our very good journals and well-established publishing very good papers. So that's the first question that I ask myself. And you need some experience, and in that sometimes it's confusing because journals have different names, and so basically it's worth to try it first. To check what the journal is. Second, is the request reasonable in time and requirements? Again, a good journal and knowledgeable editor would not give you 5 or 7 days for review. They would give you at least 2 weeks, preferably 3 weeks, and this is what anybody can expect to take a task, because all of us are busy. And we need to fit the review somehow in our schedule. So several weeks is okay, and I suggest do not accept a review that is shorter than 2 weeks, because it's simply fishy. And also don't do the review under pressure. If you need, you ask for more time, and you always can do that. And I strongly suggest doing that if you feel that the time is not sufficient. The third bullet is, did the editors do their job during screening and initial decisions, including the reviewer selection? That's exactly what Kevin described, that the editors need to screen the papers coming and reject many of them, because they do not fit the scope of the journal, or simply they're just so poorly written that they shouldn't be passed to the reviewers. Editors usually understand that they should not send the papers that are most probable for rejection, because they should respect the reviewer's time, usually very busy schedules. So then, after reading the abstract or having glanced at the paper, we should ask ourselves, what can my contribution really be? Which means whether it's really in the scope of my expertise or not, and if it is, to what extent. Sometimes the editors pick reviewers as a last resort, because the their first choice, the plan A for reviewers didn't work. So the reviewers didn't have time, couldn't be available, and so forth. So they sent the papers to whoever they feel can be at least in that kind of ballpark expertise. So you need to simply ask yourself what is how far it is really from my field. And last is basically ask yourself, do I have time to work on the review? This is what Kevin also mentioned, that you need to be sure that you can provide the review in a reasonable time. Even if extending the deadlines, I think that up to a month it means reasonable time. Yes, journals usually want much faster review, but I don't personally think that 1 month is too long. These days, the problem is that we are receiving so many requests about reviewing very bad papers, and I reject about 80%, 90% of the requests that I receive for review, and that's why we need to be simply picky. And picky, it means that we should carefully select what papers, what journals we want to support and give our time to. And some people think about how many papers should I review within a time unit. I think that between 6 and 12 papers reviewed per year is really okay. And spending a few days for review per month or every other month, I think this is the right involvement in the publishing process. I think I mentioned about the expertise. So you don't need to be a specialist in all methods and topics mentioned in the paper, but be confident that you are at least a specialist in a few of them. Okay, let's assume that the request for review was accepted. So then what do? Yes, exactly what I said. I do not abide the journal pressure to do the review ASAP. It's better to do that right than do that quick. Then I check the journal requirements or forms for review. Each journal, each publisher has a little bit different expectations. Some of them have a special form where you put the marks from 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, answering the question how data, what's the data quality, or how the conclusions match the observations or the data. So just check that so you're before starting the review, so you're not surprised in the last moment what are the requirements. Usually, besides giving an online form, all journals, at least all I've done reviews so far, all journals allow just submitting a file, just a document file with your review. What I do, again, then, which is kind of against what Kevin said, is I identify the team of authors or the senior researcher responsible for the paper's merit. It sounds like this goes against the double-blind rule, but why I do that? Because I want to check the background and previous experience of the team. I want to know how respected they are in, for example, a method that they are using or the topic. I approach a little bit different the team that has published 20 papers using the methodology that they just used in the study, than a team of researchers that just started with that particular methodology. I know that it sounds like biased toward particular authors, but in fact it's not when you keep your mind open. You can simply assume that a certain value of their data, and then you can quickly see where your experience can be valuable against their experience and against their previous papers. What I do is then I check the papers, so I call sloppiness versus carefulness of language and structure. If the paper, if the language is really poor, if the structure, if the paper is poorly organized, usually it's that the impression is really bad. Usually it means that the authors do not have experience in writing papers, and it means that this may require far more effort from my side than if the paper is written very carefully. I usually download or read a few papers that are referred to in the manuscript under review. I'm trying to see what is the methodology that they use, or the questions that they ask, the thesis that is proposed in the paper, just to get a little more familiar with the topic. And then I roughly estimate how long the review will take me, so I can organize schedule my time for that. The next, I can give you before starting the review a few tips how I approach it. First, it is the author's job to pass the message. We should not, as reviewers, we should not guess what the author, what's in the author's mind when writing a sentence or showing a figure. Everything should be clearly explained. So that actually the reviewer is not supposed to give the benefit of the doubt to the author. If it's not written, it's not there. If it's not there, it doesn't exist, period. We should not be guessing. So again, we should be, if we don't understand something, we should write it down that we don't understand and we require explanation. Everything should be clearly stated by the authors, and it's their job to do that. That includes the language. And as all of you can guess, I'm not a native English speaker. So I know how difficult it is to write in a foreign language. However, there are rules that we all learn. That's the language structure and basic rules that we have time to put on a paper. It's more difficult to speak than to write it down, because when writing we have time. And there are many opportunities to get help in editing. So if the authors do not pay attention to the language, it means that usually they just don't pay attention to details, and that's a bad sign for any paper at all. So please do not act as language editors. You are asked by the editors to do that, as Kevin mentioned. But I think this can be done in the second round of review, but not in the first one, and not in a very extensive way. So sometimes I suggest to change the organization of a paper or paragraphs or rewrite something, but I'm not editing the language. Review. This is something interesting that I recently found, that it's not expected, because some people think that review, it means that you show the good and bad points. Not really. It's not expected to give compliments. That you can keep for your partner, not for the authors. You go after questionable points, and it's a kind of assumed, and that if you don't comment on something in the paper, it's assumed that you agree and this is correct for you. This is linked to another issue that Kevin actually raised, that you should say very clearly to the editor, I can help by reviewing part A of this paper, but not part B. So basically say what will be very clear what you can and cannot review. So the part that you cannot review doesn't mean that it's correct. It simply means that you cannot review. You don't feel comfortable or confident enough to do that. And in the end, suppress your ego. Because some reviewers are trying to impress the authors or the editors, and show that the authors are absolutely wrong and the paper should be rejected because it's stupid and this and that. Sometimes this is true, but this needs to be supported by the arguments, not simply by the fact that the authors may disagree with the reviewer. And the last slide, what I would like to address here is, who is the real addressee of your peer review? This is an interesting topic itself, because you may say, well, I'm writing the review for the authors. Not necessarily. If you expect your opinion to be your decision to be minor or moderate revision, then you are really writing only to the authors, because you just point their obvious minor mistakes that can be fixed easily, and no second round is needed. So that's not a problem. Major revision, the addressee of your revision is the authors and the editor, because you need to point the problems to the authors so they can correct them, but also make the editor aware that those issues have to be taken care of. So usually I ask for the second round of revision after the major revision suggestion. And what is the basis that I use for major revision? When I have some doubts that require clarification, but they do not question the methodology and results. So, for example, there is something missing in the description, but it doesn't look like that would completely question all the study. When I see some gaps or inconsistency in the interpretation, interpretation can always be somehow changed if results are good. If there's some lacking reference to previous studies, but not crucial to the thesis of the paper or the aim of the paper that was set up, or not crucial to the conclusions. So those are not. They require these issues require extensive writing, but not necessarily change the core of the paper. The rejection. When I suggest the rejection, the addressee is the editor. The editor needs to understand, needs to be thoroughly explained why I suggest the rejection. The authors are the secondary addressees of my comments. And the rejection, the basis of rejection is basically the sloppiness of the paper, the lack of clear thesis or aim, or fundamental mistakes in the principles of the study. So that design for experimental design or wrong assumptions or irrelevant methods, something that cannot be easily corrected just by writing. That is the basis of rejection. The same poor data quality, or too high error, or simply the aim that cannot be answered using the methodology or data that was used. And also, if the study is simply redundant and the authors didn't do their homework to first read the literature before setting up the aim of the study. I would now maybe pass the floor to Dave, because he has more insight about how the review how he is doing the review.
Good morning, everybody. Just before Christmas, Kevin asked me to do a small presentation on my review process. What do I do that might be a little different from what other people do, or what can I offer to the community? We've just watched two excellent presentations on the review process, things that I wish I'd seen 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But now I have the opportunity to share something, and I think I got something interesting. So I'd like to start at the beginning. So we've just seen a lot of information, a ton of information, and honestly, I'm a little intimidated by it, and maybe some of you are too. There are so many mechanics, so many rules, so much information that you need to hold in your head as you go through the review process, and you have to do so many things simultaneously that honestly, it's intimidating. So what can I offer you to help you get past that initial intimidation of looking at a paper for the first time? And basically, what I want to do is take you through how I spend the first hour looking at a new manuscript. It's something that's brand new. It just landed on my desktop. What do I do? Okay, so I think some of this might be a little surprising to you, because most of you might expect, well, you read the abstract and you read the introduction, and if the introduction is really good, then it's going to draw you in to read the rest of the paper. But I do it a little different. I read the abstract, and the abstract helps me to understand whether or not I'm fit to review the paper. I can see things in the abstract that I'm familiar with, or I've actually worked on, or something like that. Now I've decided that, yes, I can review that paper. I think I'm capable of reviewing that paper. But as soon as I started reading the introduction, what happens to me is I get bogged down very quickly. I get bogged down by all of the history, because often an introduction starts with something like describing an area with 5 or 6 references, and then there's another sentence with 5 or 6 references, and another sentence with another 1 or 2 references. And I'm thinking about the references, I'm thinking about the history, and I still haven't answered, in my mind, I haven't answered the critical question. The critical question is basically the author. The most important part of the paper is the author. And the author has put their heart and soul into writing that paper. They've presented something to you, and in a way, there's a bond that forms between you and the author. So I really need to know something about the author. If the main component is the author, then the question that I always have is, what did the author do? I want to know exactly what did the author do and what is he contributing in this manuscript. So you have to do some detective work. And all of the questions that you want to ask about the author, it's all there in the paper, because all manuscripts have a pattern. There's a pattern that you can look into a manuscript and you can recognize you can recognize the pattern. So I go through a kind of a 6 or 7 step process. Before I do anything else, I'll do these 6 or 7 steps. I'll skim the paper. I'll just flip through it. I'm not going to read very much. I'm just going to flip through it. And the first thing I look at is the data. And because we're geoscientists, we make observations and we try and interpret the observations and then contribute something to that field of science. And so every paper has data, whether it's a field investigation, a compilation study, there's something experimental, there's going to be data. It's not very often that you see a theoretical paper that has no data. Okay, so we've got data. So I look to the data. And what am I looking for? Well, if there's data, there's going to be a sample map. And in this case, the sample is from one of my manuscripts. This is a really large area. And you can see in the bottom right, there's a lot of information available. So right off the bat, you can tell this is a compilation study. It's a compilation study, and there are a few samples that were contributed to the study, but this map is a blend of a lot of data. So right away, you should key into the fact that, man, there's a ton of data here. Another thing that you might see, perhaps, is maybe the study is much smaller. So the first map gives you the impression that it's a huge compilation study, but these images are SEM images with sample locations or laser ablation tracks or something like that. So now you're looking at something really small scale. So your impression of one versus the other, there's a big difference between these two. There's a method section. Obviously, they've collected their data somehow. And at this stage, remember, it's preliminary stage. You're just trying to get a feeling for what's going on. I kind of skip over this stuff. I assume that they've collected samples. And I assume that they have a lab somewhere and they've submitted their samples or they've done the work themselves, but I'm not going to spend any time on that. There will be data and there'll be representations of the data, either sample tables, element tables, or isotopic evidence or something. There will be data tables. And you can get a very quick impression on how careful the author has set up the study based on how well organized is the data table. In this case, clearly there's way too much information. There's too much information, too many samples. The way it's organized doesn't look very good. In fact, this just looks like something from a spreadsheet, which it is. I just copied something in from a spreadsheet. And of course, there will be representation of that data. There will be charts and graphs. And then again, you don't spend too much time on it. You just look at the charts and graphs and say, oh, this is interesting. And then I always skip, now you're into the discussion section, and maybe there's some modeling, some geochemical modeling, and the models set against the data. And, you know, this kind of looks interesting. I'd like to know more about this. I'd like to see what are the, how did the person set up the modeling? What are the variables and how did he assess the variables, et cetera? And how did he match the interpreted model, geochemical model in this case, to the data? And this looks interesting. This looks interesting to me, and I have a pretty good feeling about the paper so far when I see stuff like this. And now I'm at the stage of trying to figure out what is the author contributing here. And you consider any field of interest, whether it's something like mantle metasomatism or partition coefficients between minerals and magma or between minerals and a hydrothermal fluid, whatever that specific field of interest, there's a history. There's a development from early on 50 years ago or 5 months ago. There's a history of development of that field of interest, that scientific field. And because you're reviewing that paper and you're familiar with it, then you'll be familiar with the evolution of that scientific field. So there's the beginning on the far left at the bottom. Maybe at some point in time, there were two dominant theories on how something could have evolved, how something could have happened. And then, of course, maybe theories 1 and 2 have developed to the point that it's irresolvable. We don't know which possible theory is managing to explain that observation. And then things have continued on with 1 and 2. So where does the study fit in that overall picture? And this is where you go back to the introduction. So the introduction is going to tell you that perhaps they're attempting to confirm theory 1. So this is a pretty good contribution, because it's attempting to confirm theory 1 versus theory 2. Or perhaps it's filling a gap in the knowledge. So the introduction is where I return to after I've done my preliminary scan of all of the other stuff. I have an impression of who the author is, what the author has done, where the author is working, large scale, small scale. Now I can go back to the introduction and find out more. And of course, at this stage, at the introduction stage, if the author has done a careful job preparing the paper, then that little opening exercise that I've just described will be quick and easy. That's another way to get a good impression of the paper. It was easy for me to find out all the answers to the questions. It's taken me 20 minutes, and I'm at the stage now. I'm looking at the introduction. I'm fully engaged in the manuscript, and now I'm ready to start my review. So that's my contribution to this morning, and I hope it was helpful. So let me turn it back to Iraq.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Dave perfectly described how things should be done, and I'm now just trying to kind of follow that to show you how then you put all this knowledge and impression on a paper. So after making the judgment of the paper and understanding where are the gaps or what you can contribute to that, how I do the review is usually split the review into general and detailed comments. So I give the general comments of about the major issues of the paper that I found. So I go after major issues first. I just show if there are any mistakes, any crucial issues. I show them in my general comments. I give them in bullets, clearly separated paragraphs, so the authors can address each comment or each issue separately. And I try to be clear what I expect from the authors. So to explain something or to correct something, I try to clearly state that, or I just express my doubts about certain issues. Then detailed comments. So if I suggest the major revision, I usually don't give many detailed comments, because I assume that there will be a second round when I can take care of them. So I basically stay in the general comments. Or so if there is a rejection suggested, then I don't go to any detailed comments. In detailed comments, it's basically for the particular line or line number from a paper, or annotated paper file that I put some minor corrections or questions to answer. Then I give the conclusion and recommendation. So honest opinion, even if it requires little more writing than just short major revision or reject or minor revision. So then I try to explain why I suggest that decision that I suggest. There is an option that I always invite reviewers to use. It's the author's blind comment to the editor. So sometimes paper is bad and you don't want to be too hard on the editor, especially if it's a young researcher. But you can give some suggestions, some very honest and even brutal suggestions to the editor. That's a way to be a little diplomatic. Another way to basically approach the review is to think how you would like to see your crucial mistakes pointed in your paper. So go on the other side. Think that you made a mistake and how you want to be informed about that. And this is how you can write the review. In terms of the general picture the impression that we have from the paper, we should go and check what part of the paper is can or cannot be corrected. Data cannot be corrected. Samples and experimental design cannot be corrected. The aim that precedes these two the methods and results cannot really be corrected. So if there is a crucial mistake in these 3 points, the paper should be basically rejected. And interpretation is always a matter of discussion. In terms of data, there are many questions to ask ourselves when looking at the data. How appropriate is the methodology to answer the questions stated in the introduction? Are the authors aware of gaps or sources of error in the data? Was quality control done properly? Whether there is the accuracy and measurement error determination done properly. So basically, whether the trends that are shown and interpreted by the authors are not within the measurement error of the method or the samples. And again, is there enough data to answer the question stated in the aim? All this may look legit. However, as I say, the devil is in details. So the authors may derive conclusions not based on the true observations or trends. They may misread their own calculations or figures. So this all needs to be really carefully checked to make sure that the authors are not going after wishful thinking, but they are really interpreting the true and statistically meaningful results. Once submitting the review, we usually wait for some time, and there is a decision from the editor. You have a right to know what was the editor's decision, the final decision, and I don't always ask about that, but I would always welcome if the editor passes the decision to me. And if there is major revision, I expect that the editor includes some of my comments to the to-do list for the authors, and I hope that those my comments, the major issues will be addressed. If I suggest the rejection and the paper is not rejected, it would be really good to know why it's not rejected, and maybe even warn the editor that maybe there is something that the editor didn't fully appreciate or didn't understand from our review. So maybe give some additional information if needed. There is a second round. If there for the major revision or resubmission, there is usually a second round of review. So then, when you see that the responses from the authors, please check them very carefully. Some people claim that they They addressed everything. They are very polite, but they actually didn't. So to cross-check your comments and the answer, the author's response with what has been really done in the revised paper. So, and also I suggest that, again, there are certain principles that you may want to have the minimum standard that you want to be firm on, but certain interpretations like allow some flexibility in the interpretation because it's not your paper, it's their paper, and that paper needs to be out to be judged by the scientific community. There is one more issue in every paper that we read, either good or bad. The data may be correct, the interpretation may be correct, everything looks legit, but there is a question. The question is, so what? So what's the take-home message? Is it a new discovery, it's a new mechanism or new method, or some unexpected data that is published, or that the paper brought interest or applicability? What is really the importance of the paper? So it's not just a minor study that makes what I call the publication noise. You can imagine that you can go and collect samples almost everywhere, and there is always something to do in the formation X or Y, or there is some other experiment to perform with parameters A and B. But what it really does to the knowledge on that topic. So I suggest addressing that in the review. So the authors and the editors are aware that there is so the paper really brings something new, or it's just one of many that may eventually not be well recognized in the community. I have a final remarks, some like very personal final remarks about the process of reviewing. It's basically imagining that when I'm reviewing a paper, I imagine that I'm helping friends. I'm helping friends who may or may not be mistaken or misled, and I'm helping them to be better. And if the paper is bad, I need to make sure that the paper would not go through, because this is the editors and the reviewers' responsibility and really burden of responsibility to recognize and reject papers, bad papers, that would damage the scientific development of the field, may damage people's careers, and may lead to misusing of the funds. Because once a paper is published, especially in the renowned journal, then the young researchers would read the paper and base their further study on that paper, and this may be really detrimental to their careers. So thank you very much for listening to our presentations, and I hope that we can answer the questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Eric. And thank you to all the speakers from today. It's been a really useful discussion. Let me just have a quick look at the chat. We do have one question that I can see so far, which says, thank you for sharing your peer review process. It was really clear and useful. I have two questions regarding data presentation. Do you ever replot the data or check calculations to see if the authors have done mistakes or have done some cherry picking in their final plots and diagrams? And are you pro in insisting that authors provide a very full version of their data, for example, include their nearly raw data in the supplementary materials? Eric or Dave, I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
I have mixed feelings on that. Sometimes the data is pulled together from many different locations and compiling at many different locations and many different publications. And yes, I will try and replot data. Sometimes it doesn't look right, or if I question the results, I will replot data. And there are supplementary data tables, so the data should be made available. Maybe Eric, do you have a point of view on that?
I usually plot them. Of course, if it's something pretty obvious, then I just check quickly between the table and the plot whether data like all makes sense. If yes, that's it. But if not, I try to plot it by myself and see whether there is any mistake. The same with calculations. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Another question here. I was just wondering why a lot of journals use single-blind peer review in which reviewers know the authors. Would this not bring in a level of bias to the process, especially in a small field of research? I'm happy to give a publisher's perspective on this first, if you like. I think we do have a mix of journals which use single blind and double blind. Generally, in the STM field, single blind is seen as the industry standard, and it's the common feeling that it doesn't introduce too much bias to the process. That is one area where single blind peer review can fall down if it is a particularly small field of research. But generally speaking, the fields that we publish journals in are large enough for that not to be an issue. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to the traditions of particular disciplines. And I think, as Kevin said earlier, double blind seems to be a lot more popular within the social sciences, but within STM it's generally seen as okay to use single blind. Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
I tried to sit on the fence with it a while ago, Chris, because I can see advantages in open, double blind, single blind. The problem is that they also all come with downsides, as pointed out by Emma in her question there. So I think for now, although it's something we do review periodically, we are with single blind, though Emma's point is well made, actually. There was one other question, part of the previous one that we didn't answer, I think, was the business about publishing data sets. I, for one, personally favor the publication of data sets, raw data sets, as supplementary material. I think they should be considered as part of the peer review process so that people can take a look at them before we put them out there for the whole world. There's a general move in the publishing world now for the reader to have access to all of the data, not just the data that the author chooses to share, and I would support that.
Okay, there's another question here. When you receive a review request, do you get the whole article at once or just the abstract before agreeing to be a reviewer? I think from the point of view of publishing ethics, for example, an author submits an article to a journal and then this data is transferred to an outsider, a third person. Perhaps as the editor, I should first obtain peer review consent after the reviewer has read the abstract, and only after I get their consent, I can send them the full text. Kevin, do you want to comment on that one?
Yes, so I think I was going to mention that the very first year I spent working as an editor, as an editorial assistant back in the early 90s. Andrew Clark, who was the editor of MinMag at the time, would package up a paper, and the invitation to review included a full copy of the manuscript. It was difficult when you were sending somebody a manuscript in the post for them to say, no, thanks, I don't want to review it. These days, they get, in the request, they get a copy of the abstract and the title, and the reviewers know who the authors are, and they're asked to make a decision on the basis of that as to whether or not they'd like to review the paper. I think what I would say, and I'm keeping in mind the approach that Dave takes as he goes through the the routine that he uses, and I really liked and valued the way he described it, is that, if you say, yes, I will review this paper, and then you get the whole manuscript and you think, what, this really isn't for me because the abstract didn't describe what's in the paper or the title didn't describe. It's at that point you tell the editor, fess up. The honest answer is, I don't think I can do a good or helpful job on this, and you should find somebody else. Or else say, I can help you with this little piece, but the rest you're going to have to find somebody else. I hope that answers the question, because I'm not actually seeing the question in my version of the chat here.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that answers the question as far as I can tell. We do have one more question here. Is there a standard that advises on the choice or applicability of keywords? This seems largely unregulated and a bit of a free-for-all, or have I missed some accepted guidelines? Kevin?
Yeah, no guidelines, I'm afraid, and it pays your money and takes your choice. I do think that I certainly, as a production editor, always look at the keywords and try and think, well, is that going to help somebody find this piece of content? Is that particular word going to help in the search? And I also try and think, is there any other term here in the abstract or in the text that I would pluck out and put in as a keyword that might help somebody locate this piece of content? So when you're an author choosing keywords, or when you're a reviewer checking them, my advice would be to use that criterion. Will this help somebody to identify this as a piece of work relevant to what they might be interested in? But I don't know of any set of guidelines that specifies that.
Okay.
Chris, while we're waiting for other questions to come through, I would just say one other thing. I had one final slide, and which I won't bother to put up now, but it touches on a point that Eric made, which was, we work for Learned Society, or in North America we refer to them as not-for-profit journal publishing. Not-for-profit and Learned Society publishers put money back into the science, into the community. We support students, we support grants, we support awards for the leaders in our field, and we run meetings which are relevant to our scientific community. Commercial publishers don't do that, and predatory publishers, as Eric points out, don't do that either, and their motives for publishing are even more questionable. So my question and my encouragement to the people who are on this call today is to really consider who you accept a request for interview or for a review from. I would encourage Learned Society not-for-profit publishers first and foremost, because of the support we give back to the community. But that's just my plug for Learned Society publishing for today. We've got Roger Mitchell, who's got his camera switched on. We also have George and Chun Hui, who are other editors. If you would like to ask them a question specifically about the editorial process, now is your chance. As I mentioned earlier, we will provide answers to questions to everybody who signed up, but maybe didn't get to attend as well, if you would like that. But please do take your chance. I know we're at 1:30 now. I'm prepared to ask Chris to leave this open for another few minutes if you want to ask some more questions. I see Ellie has put a question in there, Chris.
Yeah, we do have another interesting question that's come in, which perhaps you can answer, Kevin. Some studies have shown higher rejection rates when a woman is first author, and certain other groups. Has the Mineralogical Society investigated this with regards to articles accepted for publication and sticking with single blind reviews?
Not that specific question, Ellie, no, I'll confess. So a little bit of context for you, if I may, is just this week I finished the draft of an EDI report that the Society is preparing: equality or equity, diversity and inclusivity. And in that, we found strong evidence of discrimination against women, both in our membership and in the general wider community, of survey of more than 500 people. So what I'll offer to do right now is to take a look at that in terms of the data from our submission system. During the talk I gave, I did say that we do review that single blind system on a regular basis. We've never actually taken the decision to change it. but we may well take a decision to tweak it, because I think that statistic that Ellie describes just there, if it's proven to be true from MinSoc, for example, would warrant the consideration of a double-blind system, I think, or at least an optional double-blind system. I hope that answers. I don't actually have a complete answer because we haven't considered it. Eric wants to come in there.
Yeah, I would like to comment because actually that question came from a person, Ellie Bloom, and I even cannot, as well as probably 95% of participants, when I try to see the names, I cannot guess whether this is woman or man. So as a reviewer, I have no clue. That's all I can say. So that's why it's like read the question and the study are really surprising to me, because I, not being from the it's Anglo-Saxon world, and certain names maybe of particular gender, I just don't know. So I would really be interested to see the study published, because that's where is the level that this discrimination happens. I'm almost sure that it cannot happen on the reviewer level, because we just don't know. So we cannot be prejudiced even if we want that. So thank you.
Kevin, I'm not sure on our submission system we even ask people what their gender is. I again agree with the names that don't tend to know whether people are male or female. They may even just used initials as well. I mean, you could always check, but generally.
Those are true. I take Eric's point. I would defend the vast bulk of our reviewers are certainly gender anonymous. I think that they're looking at the scientific content. That's not to say that those statistics that Ellie mentions aren't real. And I will look at it. I will take a look at it if we can, because as Helen says, we may or may not record whether it's a man or a woman writing the paper. I agree with the point Eric makes. I mean, I happen to know Ellie's far more likely to be a woman's name than that of a man, but there are plenty of names that come through on our submission system, and I don't know if they're male or female. There are almost equal male and female attendees at this morning's course. You might be interested to hear. I know that because we asked them to tell us whether they were men or women. And it is something we're working on very hard about increasing our diversity. So as I say, I will look at it, and I will send a response to the group. Thank you.
We have another question here, which says, I have a question about the duplicate publication issue. Sometimes the authors put a non-peer-reviewed copy of the manuscript in an online repository before submitting it to a journal. This non-peer-reviewed copy is often citable. Would you consider something like that as a duplicate publication? Again, I'm happy to give my view on this. Now, we're very aware that preprint servers exist, and we support their role in the research community. And no, we wouldn't, at Cambridge, we would not consider that to be a duplicate publication. However, when the article is published officially, and when it's been peer reviewed, that preprint server should provide a link to the published article where possible. And if it is on a preprint server and the article hasn't been peer reviewed, I think it should also make it clear that that is not a peer reviewed version of the article.
Yeah, we support the author's ambition to publish their work as quickly as possible, and that's why pre-publication is seen as a good thing.
George has a question.
Well, actually, Chris, it's not a question. It's a general comment on this very interesting discussion. First, I would like to thank both Arek and Dave for their contributions, which are very useful for us, for the editors. For instance, Arek is an editor in our journal as well, so he's also familiar with the problems that we face. The first, as a general comment, the role of reviewers is, I would say, the backbone reviewers are the backbone of the scientific process, because without them we cannot publish the findings, and we cannot help our results to promote science. So they are, I would say, crucial. The problem is that, as Arek mentioned, people nowadays, it was not like that in the past, but today is more or less the case, that people don't have time to review articles. So I have to say that when I began my role, my role as an editor in Clay Minerals, one of the associate editors simply stepped down and resigned because to use a colloquial expression, he was fed up with people denying to review papers. He had some cases of asking 10, 12, 13 people and to review a paper that he was handling, and he got denials. So it's crucial to find the correct people. And the other thing is that for people who want to review papers, to remember that it's better to deny it in the first place than accept to review a paper and then disappear. One of the problems that we face in the traditional journals, in both MinMag and ourselves, Clay Minerals, are traditional in this business, is that we have to compete with predatory journals which promise publication within, let's say, 2-3 weeks. So we do not want to drop the standards of revision. And as Arek very correctly said before, that we should not accept reviewing papers in less than 2 weeks. It's very suspicious. But on the other hand, we have to keep a reasonable publication schedule. So this means that we have to decrease, to have a compromise, a balance between what we call a predatory schedule and what we mean a very extensive, very long time for very long turnabout time from submission to acceptance. So the contribution of the reviewers is critical. And there's another point which is very important, is that very often, thanks to good reviews, we are able to spot cases of plagiarism. This is quite interesting. Actually, we had a case in Clay Minerals very recently. Actually, this was not a plagiarism. It was a case in which the author submitted the same papers to 2 journals, and we're expecting to see which journal will accept their work faster to withdraw it from the other journal. And we were, let's say, the journal which did not submit our final decision earlier, so the guy simply retracted, so he removed the paper from our journal. But this is a case, this is another example in which the reviewers can help us to resolve these issues. So yes, the experiences of both Dave and Arek are crucial, and I think that they will be very helpful for the audience. We are eager for, and we are willing to receive the contribution of, especially of young people, people who are in the first stages of their research career, just finished their PhD. Actually, from my experience, and I think that most of you, most of people who are involved in the editorial business, they remember from their younger years that they were, I would say, more severe reviewers when they were young. The older you become, unfortunately, probably you will become softer. I don't know. I find very often in my case, but young reviewers, probably because they're enthusiastic and they are, I mean, they are, I would say they do more thorough job in review. So we are eager for such people, and we also welcome younger people who want to review our papers. So I don't have to add anything else on this from my side, my point of view at least.
Thank you, George. Kevin, I'm aware that we're a little over time and I can't see any more questions in the chat. Would you be happy to end the session here?
We do have one hand up, Dr. Ranjan.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that.
Let's take that one and we can draw to a close after that, Chris. Thanks.
Okay.
Oh, hello. Am I audible now? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So very good. So thank you for a very good discussion here, and we learned a lot of things. I have one query is that sometime that is with my case also I faced some problem while I was in author that in our Indian it is that they are in our Indian Council of Agriculture Research, so being the employee of the so there is a policy that they publish the thesis of the PDF of the thesis online, of the PhD thesis or the MSc thesis online. So after that, when we are making some manuscript from out of that MSc or PhD thesis, then some plagiarism software this is catching, and then it is showing the large amount of similarity, and sometimes this is questioned by the reviewers and the editors that how this is to be happened, and then we have to defend. And after our argument or after our defend, some editors are willing to to accept us, say that this is okay, we can accept your manuscript and we can send it for review. And some journals do not do that job, and they simply reject the manuscript. So in that case, what is the and as I just wanted to ask to the Criminal Society that in that case, what is the correct way to do or handle that things?
Looks like Helen's up for that one, Chris, if you like. Thanks, Helen.
We have just had one like that, but I mean the way I've treated it so far is that it was a PhD thesis. It came up with a really high score, but certainly at MinMag we read the score and assess it, and it's gone out for review. So I can say that it's not an automatic rejection at Mineralogical Society. I can see that where it's come from, so it's not a problem for us at the moment.
Yeah, I'd echo that point, Helen. Thanks. When Helen says score, what she means is we use a plagiarism tracking tool as part of our manuscript tracking system. It's called Authenticate, and what it does is it looks at the content of a paper submitted for consideration, and it will indicate to the editors how much, if any, of the content has been published previously. And if a thesis is available online, you'll get a very high score. As Helen said, a very high percentage of the material will have been produced. But as she also said, we look at the context. We look at what that means in detail. If it's published in a set of papers in another journal, then we would not be so keen. But I think an online thesis is a different matter, and we would certainly consider that for a new publication.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ranjan.
Okay, I think if there are no more questions, then I think we can draw the session to a close. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been fantastic to have so many of you here today. And thank you again to our speakers for a very detailed and interesting presentation.
Thanks for hosting, Chris, and I echo your thanks to everybody attending. Brilliant.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay.